We're very pleased to welcome all of you to this, this conversation today. Let me first introduce Professor Judith Olson, who's been Professor of Informatics on this campus, and she's co-chair of this session today.
The School of Information and Computer Science is very delighted to co-sponsor this. This is in a continuing dialogue about what it means to actually teach and learn in the digital world. We're very happy you're here, and we hope to see you again at other events.
Thank you. Let me quickly introduce our speaker today. Daphne Koller is Professor of Computer Science at Stanford, where she got her Ph.D. And she's also, of course, the co-founder, along with Andrew Ng, of the Coursera, which is a startup company that's dedicated to providing MOOCs, massively online courses. UCI was one of the first 33 campuses to join Coursera. We currently have 6 courses on the Coursera platform with over 250,000 signups. And so we've launched all 6 of those courses, and they're going very well. And we're very delighted to be a part of this new revolution. Some people call it revolution, some people call it disruptive, some call it transformative. Whatever adjective we end up using, we'll see. But in any event, Daphne is here to talk to us about her experience and some of the things that she's learned, and also where she thinks things are going. Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you. So thank you, Judith and Gary, for the invitation to present here, and thank you all for taking some time out of your afternoon to come listen to me. I'd like to correct one thing that Gary said in his introduction, which is that we don't actually view ourselves as a startup devoted to putting out MOOCs. We view ourselves on a quest to provide education to everyone, which is why this is the title of this talk. So I'm going to start and end this talk with education for everyone. Thank you, Melissa. And then the online revolution is going to be the meat of it in the middle. We started this project just about a year ago, in January of 2012. And as we were starting this project, there was an incident that really drove home the need for what we were doing and why we were doing it. Many countries around the world are not as blessed as the United States in having an educational system that provides ready access to education. I mean, we can quibble about costs, but ready access to education to anyone who wants it. One such country that does not have capacity to accommodate the many students who want it is South Africa, where the educational system was constructed in the days of apartheid for the white minority, and as a consequence, there are just not enough positions today available for the many more people who want a high-quality education and deserve one. Matters came to a particularly tragic event in January 2012, when at the University of Johannesburg, one of the big public universities in South Africa, there were a handful of slots left open from the 1 of 8 admissions process that the university has in terms of number of people admitted relative to the number of applicants. And as the university got ready to reopen those slots for admission, the night before, there was a line of people literally a mile long outside the gate, hoping to be first in line to get one of those positions. And when the gates opened in the morning, there was maybe not surprisingly a stampede, and 20 people were injured and 1 woman died. She was the mother of a son, and you could say that she literally died trying to give her son a chance at a better life. So this lack of access to education is one of the things that we're hoping to accomplish with the effort that I'm going to tell you about today. Following our launch in April, Thomas Friedman, who has a way with words like very few other people, wrote up about this effort. And what he wrote is the big breakthroughs are what happened when what is suddenly possible meets what is desperately necessary. The desperately necessary was the previous slide. The suddenly possible was exemplified or demonstrated by the Stanford experiment that took place in the fall of 2011. Stanford, as an experiment, took 3 somewhat advanced courses in computer science and opened them up to the world. And they, there was the expectation that either would be few thousand people registered, but in each and every one of those classes, there was an enrollment of 100,000 students or more. So to clarify what that means, one of those classes is the largest of the three as taught at Stanford, with an enrollment of 400 every time it's offered. This is the machine learning class taught by my colleague Henry. That class, when offered to the public, had an enrollment of 100,000 students, which means that if Andrew wanted to have the same impact and reach by teaching his Stanford class, he would have to teach it for 250 years. So I think the magnitude of the opportunity at that point became readily apparent, and we decided at that point that one needed to somehow live up to that. And as a consequence, we spun this out of Stanford in order to enable multiple universities to help provide education to the world. And in the months since January 2012, we now have 33 top universities, of which we're very pleased to have UCI as one, offering 215 courses to people around the world for free. We have 2.5 million students. Actually, this is a slide that's really hard to keep updated because I put 2.5 on there 2 days ago. It's now 2.57 million students. It's just impossible to keep track. From every country around the world, with the exception of North Korea. So these are some of the 33, these are the 33 universities that are working with us, and you can see a lot of names that you'll recognize. Many of the top US institutions are represented here, whether it's top private institutions like Stanford, Princeton, Caltech, Duke, Penn, and others, Columbia. Top public institutions like university, like UC Irvine, like UCSF, like University of Virginia, University of Washington, and others, as well as, at the moment, 8 international institutions, and soon to be coming on board several others that are all contributing courses to help teach the world. The courses are actually a remarkable diversity of disciplines. So whereas people typically think of online education often in the context of STEM disciplines, math and science, here we actually have courses that span the range. It includes courses like Introduction to Philosophy from the University of Edinburgh, Global Challenges, Mental Health and Illness, Growth to Greatness from the Darden Business School in Virginia, Astrobiology, Modern and the Postmodern taught by the president of Wesleyan, Linear and Discrete Optimization, and many more. We even have a performance music class, a jazz improv class by the Berkeley School of Music. So it's really a remarkable breadth of topics that one can now offer to students in this large open course format. Now, the other aspect of this is the students, the 2.57 million students and growing that we've been able to help educate. These are just a few of the stories about where access can really make a difference to people's lives. So this is Raul, who did not have access to any kind of computer science education in his home country, took some of the computer science courses from Stanford, Princeton, UW, and elsewhere online, used that as the basis for his Fulbright application, and is now coming to study in the United States. Jolene, who lives in Pakistan, and took the Sociology 101 class, and with a fellow student in the class, inspired by the topics that she learned in the class, founded an NGO together with her friend, and who she met online. And then Achint, who learned the gamification, took the gamification course from Wharton, learned how to become an entrepreneur, got an internship at a company, and is now competing in an all-India entrepreneurship competition. Now these are access stories that I'm sure you're all expecting to see, but let me show you one that I'm not sure you're expecting. This is Daniel on the right. Daniel is a 17-year-old boy who's severely autistic. He has a speaking vocabulary of about 150 words. He communicates primarily by typing on an iPad. And nevertheless, he was the star student in Penn's Modern and Contemporary American Poetry class. You can see him with the instructor of the class sitting on the left. Now, Daniel tells us, and his father concurs, that not only is this the first meaningful educational experience that Daniel has had after a life of special ed, that the rigor of the experience combined with the lack of need to leave the house and look people in the eye is something that is actually helping alleviate the severity of his disease. So clearly not a cure, but something that is very helpful to him. We get stories like that, not just about autism, although autistic people seem to resonate particularly well with this form of teaching. We also have stories from We got one just last week from a woman with stage 4 breast cancer who, because of chemotherapy, can't leave the house, but this is a way for her to engage with the outside world. And so this really opens access to populations of students who would otherwise really go without any kind of ability to have this kind of learning experience. So let me talk a little bit about the course experience and what distinguishes it from the many open courseware initiatives, of which UCI also has a very long history, on Larry specifically. What makes this different? It's not passive content that you just come and you watch and that's it. This is an attempt to bring into the online world something that looks and feels like a college class. So the course begins on a given day, and a cohort of students goes through it together. And then every week there is material that you're responsible for learning. And you're supposed to learn the material, and then there's homework that checks whether you did the work. And the homework is graded. And if you don't do the homework, you don't get a grade. And you can see the impact of homework and deadlines in this usage graph that's on the slide, where the x-axis is time and the y-axis is the load on the website. And you see those spikes? Those spikes are deadlines. Everybody logs in the day before the deadline to do their homework, just like in a college class. And then, kind of like in a college class, there's a reward at the end. At the end, the students get a certificate. And that certificate is not official and it's not credit-bearing, although I'll come back to certification at the end of the talk. But it's enough for students to gain a material advantage by being able to demonstrate to, say, an employer that they now understand machine learning and put them in line for a better job. And we have heard from many of our students that this has actually been very instrumental to them in their ability to move ahead in life, whether it's in a college education or in a job setting. I'm going to talk now about the 3 pillars of the student experience in one of those MOOCs. The first is the video-based instruction. And let me first show you what that looks like as a video.
And generally, we'll start with some set of players as accepted.
So you can see, you can watch at 1.5 speed, which the students love. It's a lot easier to watch at 1.5 speed with subtitles. And you can watch with subtitles in different languages. So the nice thing about this, and this is not rocket science in any way, but the nice thing about this is students really do get to watch at their own pace. So if they're kind of getting it and it's going a little bit slowly for them, they can watch at an accelerated pace. If they've stopped getting it, they can pause, take notes, rewind, watch again. And this allows us to basically let students assimilate at the rate that they're comfortable with, as opposed to at the rate that is intended at some median of the population in a 500-person classroom. Another aspect of the video format is that it actually opens the door to much more creative teaching formats than you can do in a physical classroom just because of the constraints. So for example, the Illinois Sustainability class shot many of its videos in the field in places where sustainability issues are clearly manifest. The Introduction to Sociology class from Princeton was, in addition to the weekly lecture material, had a weekly session where they had a discussion between the instructor, who you can see on the left, 2 Princeton students, and about 6 to 7 students taken from different countries around the world, each representing their own society's perspective on the sociological question of the day. And Mitch Nir, who was the instructor, says he learned more about sociology from teaching his class this one time than he learned in any of all the 12 years that he's had teaching at Princeton, because of the range of diverse perspectives that the students came in with, a very global point of view. And then at the bottom right, there is, this is the gamification class from Wharton. That character that you see in the middle of the screen is actually the instructor teaching a class as a computer game character to demonstrate some points. So you could really have some room for creativity. The other aspect is the personalization of the learning experience. So not only can you watch at your own pace, by breaking away from the shackles of classroom scheduling constraints, we can break the material up into much more natural units than hour and 15-minute long intervals. And so you can break up into chunks or modules, each of which is 8 to 12 minutes long, and then students can traverse them at their own pace. And because it's all there and available online, you could also have more flexibility. So for example, you might have prep stuff that is needed by some students, but maybe not all, or some optional material that some students find interesting, but perhaps not everyone. And so you can use this type of paradigm to break away from the one-size-fits-all model of education that's been forced on us by the need to scale our education to 300 people sitting in an auditorium. So that's the video piece, and I would say that while important, it's the least interesting piece of this user experience. As important, or maybe more important, is the fact that this is not just you sitting watching passively while video is streaming at you, but rather there is constant interaction with the material that the students have to do. So here, this is inspired by a number of studies that people have done. This is a science paper from 2011 that specifically speaks to how important it is for students to be forced to retrieve information rather than just learning it passively. And you can see that in terms of performance, students who engage in retrieval practice, which is just, do you remember what I told you 15 minutes ago? Those students perform much better than students who are given the same amount of time to just review the material passively. And so we tried to build in that kind of constant interaction into the user experience. And so here's what that would look like. So, why is my phone having trouble with this?
Who's working it? Prospect theory, economic discount, status quo bias, base rate bias.
So the video is running, and then it's going to hit that yellow notch. And when it does, the video pauses, and the students get asked the question. Students answer the question. They're given immediate feedback as to whether they're right or wrong, given an opportunity to try again, and then there's an optional explanation if they want. Now, this is similar to the kinds of questions that I or many of you as instructors would ask in class. But what happened when we asked the question in class? 80% of the students are still scribbling the last thing we said. The ones in the back are all on Facebook. Right? And then there's the smarty pants in the front row who blurts out the answer before most of the classes even notice that a question has been asked. And then I, as the instructor, am incredibly gratified that somebody knew the answer to the question, and so the lecture moves on. And here, every single student engages with the material in a much more interactive way. Now, these little baby questions are not where the deep learning happens, so that happens in the weekly homeworks. And of course, if you're teaching a class to 100,000 students, even if you're Stanford University, you cannot afford to pay 5,000 teaching assistants. And so you need to come up with a way of providing students with meaningful, formative feedback at a scale of tens of thousands of people. So how do you do that? One option, obviously, is to have the computer help with the grading. And fortunately, there is a number of fairly interesting types of work that a computer can now auto-grade. That ranges from the obvious, multiple choice, slightly less obvious, but still pretty banal, short answer questions with some amount of variability for, say, spelling corrections and things like that. Slightly more interesting yet, the ability to grade math expressions in a way that doesn't just examine the syntactic identity of the expression, but rather whether it's semantically equivalent to the right expression. So 0.5 times x is the same as x squared over 2. And then in addition, you can also grade deeper work. Anything that has a structured form as an output can be graded, whether it's the output of a computer program, the output of a computer model, whether for a physical system, a financial system, or whatever, or even an Excel spreadsheet, as long as it has a particular structure, you can now grade a marketing model or a financial model, for example. And all of that can be graded without any kind of human intervention. So let me show you one of the programming assignments in our classes. This is the CS 101 Stanford course, and the student is actually supposed to color correct the image that you see on the right. This is JavaScript, they're programming in the browser. They try it, they see that it's not quite right, so they get a chance to try again. We'll come back to this notion of try and retry. This time they got it right, so they can move on to the next assignment. So this notion of trying and retrying is actually an integral part of the pedagogy that we try and encourage our instructors to use. What happens when you submit a piece of work, a homework, in an on-campus class? You submit it, TA's graded, 2 weeks later you get the score back and you say, darn it, I got 70 out of 100, that's a shame. But that's the end of it. You don't go back and try and do it again. Because by that point, the class has moved on. Here, you're given immediate feedback. And so students naturally move to treating this as a computer game. It's like, I can do better than 70 out of 100. And so they try it again, and again, and again. And so what you see here on the left is the distribution in blue bars is the score for an assignment, and it happens in our, one of our programming classes. This is pretty uniform. And you can see the blue bars are the initial submission, and the green bars is the distribution of scores for the final submission. You can see that the vast majority of the students in the class have, without being particularly told to do so, naturally gravitate towards mastering learning. Now, the obvious question you might ask is, okay, so they do better on this assignment, but does that mean they learn better? And the answer is that the answer does seem to be yes. So some analytics that we did just over the last month, so this is pretty hot off the press. You can see that students who have comparable ability on problem set 1, the ones who do mastery learning do better on problem set 2 than the ones who don't. And so this actually does help learning outcomes down the line, not just the score on this one assignment. So all that was well and good, but when we went around talking about this with faculty back in January, February of last year, a lot of the humanities faculty came to us and said, okay, we don't really do much math, spreadsheets are not a big factor, certainly not very much programming, so does that leave us with multiple choice? And when we tried to say that multiple choice is underrated, that didn't go over really well. So we had to do something different. And what we did is we put together a peer grading model, which is actually based on the calibrated peer review, which was developed at UCLA. And we built on that, adding in elements of crowdsourcing into the pipeline in order to make it scale up to the kinds of 20 or 30 or 40,000 person classes that we're talking about. And what that means is that a student grades the work of their peers in the class using a grading rubric that is very carefully designed by the instructor. And the instructor defines the criteria, defines what it means to be good, medium, or bad on each of the criteria, and then the students apply that criterion, that rubric to the work of their peers. So here's an example from the Penn genomics class, where students are really doing critical thinking in the most precise sense of the word. They are critiquing a scientific paper. And the instructor tells the students how to critique a critique. That is, how you should evaluate a critique provided by one of their fellow students to see if it's deep, insightful, correct, and so on and so forth. So you could do that with peer grading, but you could also do a lot of other things with peer grading. So here, for example, is some results from the Introduction to Sociology final exam, which is a set of essay questions, free-form essay questions, where, again, the instructor designed the rubric. In this case, it was a very well-designed grading rubric, which basically gives us really great results. And so Professor Mitch Nir actually, and his TAs, actually graded all of the final exams in the class. There were several thousand of them. And you can compare the teacher score, which is the score given by the TAs, to the score given by fellow students. You can see there's a very nice correlation between those two. Now, of course, if you design a very bad grading rubric, you're not going to see results like that. But for a good grading rubric, it shows that you can achieve these results. And I can tell you, this was a hard test. I looked at it and I couldn't do it. So it's not an easy test and it's not easy to grade either. And you can actually now start giving instructors a set of analytics to tell them, for example, whether their grading rubric is good or not. So here, for example, you see a comparative result of two rubrics. The one on the left, there's one on the left and one on the right. And what you see here is deviation of graders from the median score. And you can see that the grading rubric on the left is very tightly clustered, which means students will be grading very consistently. And the one on the right has a much broader spread, which means that the one on the right is not a very good grading rubric because it has a lot more variability in what the students assign. And so you can give those analytics to instructors to help them provide better grading rubrics. Now, the nice thing about peer grading is that it really does lend itself to a huge range of different types of assignments. So not only essay questions, but here, for example, is the Penn design class from the Wharton Business School, where students throughout the duration of the course iteratively started with a concept to a prototype to a final artifact. Each week they submitted it, got feedback from 5 of their peers, so that by the end of the course, after 8 grading cycles, they had gotten 40 different pieces of feedback from 40 different people. And at the end, they produced artifacts that look like this. So this is a laptop table. You can see there's a vent there for the heat. There's a charging station that plugs into the wall so that you don't need necessarily a table next to the plug. A space-efficient bookshelf and table that folds into the wall. And let me tell you the one interesting aspect of this particular choice is I looked at the images from the design class, and I picked the ones that I thought would be fun and nice to show people. And only afterwards did we look at the names of the students and notice that they came from 3 different continents. There's one from India, one from Spain, and one from the Philippines. And this is kind of just an illustration of the worldwide reach of this. The other aspect of peer grading is the fact that it really does build a community among the students. And students get a tremendous amount from interacting with their students on the material and getting their feedback. So here, for example, in the American poetry class from Penn, whose instructor you saw in the picture with Daniel earlier, the instructor had all of the assignments, which were essays on poems, posted to the discussion forum, which I'll talk about in just a moment, together with all of their peer grades. And then other students could go in and continue to comment. And you can see one thread here, which is an essay on the poem by Ezra Pound, had 60 students posting additionally beyond the peer grades, and 872 students doing the discussion. Which naturally leads to the third pillar of the student experience, which is that of the community that's being built around these courses, that's generated by the fact that everyone's going through the class at the same time, so that they're all thinking about the same material at about the same time. So community is generated by several different mechanisms. First of all, there's the discussion forum, which is really the primary mechanism for students to get questions answered. Because one thing that just does not scale is an instructor answering questions for 10,000 or 50,000 students. I mean, I can tell you from my own Stanford classes, answering questions for 100 students is already excruciating. For 10,000 students, this is completely infeasible. And so what we've done is replace the one-to-many model of interaction with the many-to-many. Students post questions on the discussion forum, and other students answer those questions. Questions are voted up and down, answers are voted up and down, so the best ones bubble to the top, which makes the whole thing much more effective. And that means that students get actually very quick and often extremely high quality answers to their questions. In fact, the students tell us that this is in many ways a much more interactive and friendly in some ways a form of learning than many on-campus classes that they've taken, where they walk into class, the instructor talks at them for an hour, and then they go home. Here there is much more interaction that's happening. Now, counterintuitively perhaps, this is a case where larger courses are actually better than smaller ones. So what you see here is the x-axis is the number of active users on the site, and the y-axis is the response time, the median response time to have a question answered on the forum. And you can see that the larger the class, the faster the response time. And anecdotally, the better the answers. And so this is a place where more students actually gives rise to a better as opposed to a worse student experience. The other community building happened organically. We didn't even suggest it, it just happened. Students would post on the site, on the forum, a comment that says, I'd like to study with some people. And I'm in Kandahar, and I'm going to be at this coffee shop Thursday at 5, so let's form a study group. And it would just coalesce. So right now we have about 1,800 different meetups, physical meetups, around the world in pretty much every country. And in addition to the physical ones, we also have virtual communities that form, where people meet via Google Hangout or some other video conferencing, or even just on a Facebook group or something. And they communicate with each other often across country lines and cultural lines. And one of the things that we've seen is that people end up communicating in many cases with people from societies that they would not normally engage with. And that is a broadening experience for everyone involved. So now I'm going to take a step back and talk about some of the higher level things one can get from this. The first is the data. The data is absolutely unbelievable because we measure every single event on the system. Every time a student plays the video, pauses, rewinds, submits a quiz, posts on the forum, reads a post on the forum, all of that is recorded. And it's recorded not for 20 students, it's recorded for 50,000 students. So all of a sudden you have data that is both qualitatively and quantitatively different from pretty much any educational data set that anyone has ever collected. And so now you can start answering questions that you really couldn't answer before. So for example, you could do that in the context of a particular course. I'll give one illustration of that. This is a distribution of wrong answers from one of Andrew's machine learning exercises. So the answers happen to be pairs of numbers, which is why you can map them on a grid. Each little cross is a one-off wrong answer where a student came up with a really creative way of being wrong. The big crosses are ones where people converge on the same wrong answer. So the one at the top left, for example, is where 2,000 students made the exact same mistake. Now, if 2 students in a class of 100 make the same mistake, you'd never know. But if 2,000 students make the same mistake, it jumps out at you. And so Andrew and his TAs went in, looked at what the students were doing, figured out the misconception, and now whenever another assignment falls into that bucket, the students don't get just an error message saying, sorry, you're wrong. They get an error message, you're wrong, and you might want to think about it this way, which guides them much faster towards a better learning outcome. So this is a local lesson that one learns about a particular course. You could also answer broader pedagogical questions about human learning. For example, one question that's often been asked, and there's papers in the literature going in both directions, whether the instructor's face in the video is a good thing or a bad thing. Good thing because it humanizes, bad thing because it distracts from looking at the content. And as I said, there's papers pointing both ways. Well, the nice thing is that now we can do what's called in Silicon Valley jargon, A/B testing. A/B testing is something that all internet companies, I think, do, which is they divide the population into 2, and if you log on to Google, there's a 10% chance on any given day that you'll fall into the test population where they're trying out a new user experience. This is a little bit different from the old one. And then they measure outcomes, and within days, if the new population is doing better on whatever outcome is of interest relative to the old population, the entire site flips over, which is why they get incrementally better and better and better in a cycle of days as opposed to months or years. Well, now we can do the same with pedagogy. So here's an A/B test. Group A got the instructor's face. Group B didn't get the instructor's face except a little bit at the beginning and the end of the video. And what happened? The students who didn't get the instructor's face started complaining vehemently on the discussion forums that they couldn't focus because it wasn't engaging. And we actually had to stop that experiment in the middle because the student experience was just, according to the students, so much worse for them. Here's another experiment that came out as a surprise. Sending students emails that there's a deadline coming up. Seems like obviously a good idea, right? It's a reminder, they're going to log into the site and they're going to do their homework, right? Well, turns out the answer is a little bit more subtle. So here's the email that we sent, and there's actually 3 elements that we played around with. One is reminding the students what the deadline is. The second is telling them what they've already done and what they haven't. And the third is the infographic at the bottom that tells them how far along in the class they are relative to completing it at the end. So here's the interesting thing. Of these emails, all but one combination actually reduced retention rates. The only one that increased retention rates is where all 3 of these were present. If you just reminded people that there's a deadline coming up, they felt like they were being nagged and were less likely to come back. And so you learn something about what works and what doesn't. Now you can improve the student's experience for the next generation. And at a cycle of days or weeks rather than months or years. Okay, so this is a brand new section, added it this morning. Talks about the last piece of this, which is the credentials at the end, what the students get from all this. And actually, there's an evolution here. When we started this out, Stanford only let us provide what's called a statement of accomplishment. So the statement of accomplishments is a letter from the instructor, so you can see it's signed by the instructor. There's a huge legal boilerplate at the bottom that says this is not Stanford, this is not a Stanford course, it's not equivalent to any Stanford course, it doesn't include Stanford credit, and the student identity has not been verified. That was the first generation. This is, but nevertheless, it worked for people. University of Helsinki, on a regular basis, gave people credit for these courses, even just with that. People got jobs with that. This is our next generation. This is something we put into place about 3 weeks ago. It was initially put into place with the Duke class, and there's several other classes coming on board. This is called the signature track, and it's intended exactly to address that legal boilerplate of this identity, the student's identity has not been verified. In these certificates, the student's identity has been verified. It's verified by a person who compares a government-issued ID to a webcam picture. The student sets up a biometric profile, and every time they submit work, it's them at the keyboard submitting the work. And so they get now a much nicer identity verified certificate that carries more substance as well as the university brand. Now, because this now costs money and we're committed to access, one of the things that we put in place even as this went out is a financial aid application. So if a student really needs this kind of certificate and they can't afford the whatever $50 that it costs, they can apply for a financial aid application and just get it for free. They write why they need it and why they can't afford it, and then they just get it for free. And currently of the signature track that we have, the students that have applied for that, about a quarter are financial aid applicants. One step beyond that is something that actually confers academic credit, which is a holy grail for students who are degree seeking, which is not all of our population, but is certainly part of it. So in that light, we have in November discussed with the American Council for Education, which many of you probably know is an umbrella organization for U.S. institutions, U.S. academic institutions, very long, well-established. And ACE has an ACE credit program where they assess credit equivalency of non-traditionally taught classes. Typically, these are small face-to-face classes taught in government and military, sometimes in industry. And they assess those classes for academic standards, learning outcomes, and so on and so forth. And they basically come out with a recommendation that says, yep, this engineering course that you took as a mechanic in the military is equivalent to 3 units of electronics or EE electives, for example. And students then use that as prior learning and can apply to many, if they apply and get admitted to one of the institutions, about 2,000 in the ACE network, the institution has the option of recognizing those credits as transfer credits. So the interesting thing is, it's not the university that provided the course that gives the credit. It's certainly not Coursera that gives the credit, because we don't give credit. It's the institution that the student eventually enrolls in that gives the credit. So here, in order to ensure yet another level of academic integrity, the students actually have a proctored final exam where they do the work, and you can see what that looks like. This is what's being used right now in most of the online degree programs, like Western Governors and so on. It's actually very reliable. I can talk more about that if people care. And anyway, the AC is now, as we speak, reviewing a handful of our courses for credit equivalency, and we're actually quite optimistic about how this is going to turn out. Final place where this might end up being useful is a different way of giving credit, which is within our own academic institutions. The idea here being to move away from this, which is the students lined up, sitting there passively taking notes. And what we are moving towards instead is academic institutions that are using content that's online to do this content conveyal, and then in class having a much more engaging discussion along these lines. Which brings us to the last topic here, which is improving learning outcomes. And there's at least 2 different ways in which we believe this paradigm can change the quality of the learning experience for our students. One happens in the online world, and one happens in the physical world. The online world goes back to almost 30 years ago to a very famous paper by renowned educational researcher Benjamin Bloom, who wrote a paper called the 2 Sigma Problem. In that paper, Bloom studied 3 populations. The first are students taught in a lecture-based class. And mind you, not even a very large lecture. It had, I think, 35 or 40 students. And this is a distribution of achievement scores, standard Gaussian distribution. The second population were students taught still in a lecture, but in a mastery learning format, which means they couldn't move on to the next topic without having demonstrated mastery in the previous one. That shifts the entire curve to the right by an entire standard deviation. The final one is students lucky enough to have an individual human tutor. That shifts the curve of achievement scores yet another standard deviation, or sigma as it's called in statistics, to the right. What does a 2 sigma improvement in performance scores correspond to? If you pick the median point of the lecture-based class as the performance threshold, so half the students in that population are above and half are below, and you take that same performance threshold and apply it to the green curve, 98% of the students are going to be above that threshold. So 98% of the students are above average. They will be gone. Now, hence the 2 sigma problem. Because as a society, we can't afford to give an individual human tutor to every student. But in these days, maybe we can afford to give them a tablet or at least a smartphone. Which now begs the question of, can we use technology now to move us from the blue curve to the red curve and even to the green curve? The red curve is actually pretty easy, because here's the nice thing about computers. If you watch the same video for the 5th time, they do not get judgmental. They're fine with it. Furthermore, they're even fine with grading your homework for the 3rd time, even if you submit it again and again. And so mastery is actually easy to achieve, and we've already shown some of those examples earlier. The kind of personalized attention that you get from an individual human tutor, of course, is a much higher bar to reach. There's pieces of personalization in what I've shown you today, but it's only small pieces, whether it's the ability to progress at your own pace, or the somewhat personalized feedback that we can provide to students on their work, but definitely nowhere close at the moment to what a human tutor would provide. But I think it's a really fascinating research challenge that we should try and aspire to. So that was the virtual world. What about the physical world? So here is one of my favorite quotes. It's typically attributed incorrectly to Mark Twain. That says that the college is a place where a professor's lecture notes go straight to the student's lecture notes without passing through the brains of either. I don't think that's an entirely unfair damnation of what happens in a 300-person auditorium. So what should we do with that precious time where we and the instructors and the students are in the same room at the same time? Plutarch tells us a different thing. He tells us that the mind is not a vessel that needs filling with content, but rather wood that needs igniting. And so maybe what we should do in our classes is try and ignite the imagination, the passion for the discipline, build creative problem-solving and thinking skills. And so people smarter than myself have done this for a number of years now. This is a very nice paper by Nobel Prize-winning physicist Carl Weinman from the University of British Columbia, who did an active learning experiment in a large physics class, as well as in a whole range of other classes. And he basically doesn't lecture. All of the content conveyal happens before the students come to class. And when the students come to class, they do active problem solving in small groups, dialogue with each other, dialogue with the instructor. And he demonstrates that on every single metric, attendance, engagement, and learning, if you compare the lecture class to an active learning population, the active learning population does considerably better, including on performance in a standardized test. So, one of our instructors from Wharton, Christian Turwish, is an operations research specialist. And he did a case study on Coursera and MOOCs as his last lecture in his Coursera class. And he basically argues that MOOCs move the Pareto optimal frontier of education from where it currently is on the left to a new frontier on the right. And that new frontier gives us a range of possibilities. If we care primarily about cost, we can keep student learning pretty much the same as, say, in a large lecture class, and move the cost down to what is effectively now a zero marginal cost per student, which is how we can provide free education to everyone. Or you can move along this axis, keeping the costs the same, but improving student learning using some of the methods that I just told you about, or anywhere else along that spectrum. And so it gives us a new range of possibilities on how to exploit this technology to reduce costs, improve learning outcomes or goals. Which brings me to the end of the talk, the last 2 slides, which is education for everyone. By providing readily accessible education to everyone, you could do 2 amazing things. If you look at the distribution of students that we have right now, the vast majority of them, about 80%, are students with degrees, half of those with advanced degrees. Now, I think that's going to change as we do more and more credit-bearing classes, but nevertheless, when you think about it, your traditional college education lasts the first 4 or 6 years of your adult life. And then there's the whole rest of your life after that. And the days in which what we learned in college was still good enough to sustain us 15 years later as productive members of society, those days are long gone. The world is moving much too quickly. And so what we see here is a population of continuing learners who want to get a refresher course, a booster shot of education throughout their lifetime, and thereby keep themselves more productive and more engaged. The second population that we see is the education for everyone. About a third of our population is in North America. Less than 30% are in Europe. And everybody else is in largely the developing world. Asia, South America, Africa, and Oceania. And that number is growing. And these are people who, by and large, like our African students at the very beginning of the talk, do not have access to education. And so what do you do by giving people access to education? The first thing is that education is the great democratizer. And if you take education and turn it from a privilege to a basic human right, it means that anyone who has the skill and the motivation can basically learn something that can make a better life for themselves and their families. And that would be an amazing thing. The other thing that you could do is the serendipity. which is, we don't know where the next Albert Einstein is going to come from. Maybe she's living in a small village in Africa right now. And if we give her access to this kind of education, maybe she'll invent the next great idea that will make the world a better place for everyone. Thank you very much.